Maureen.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Molly Anderson. I am the Executive Director of UB's Center for Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness, and I'd like to welcome you to our new series, 52 Weeks of Leadership, giving you what you need to lead in 2021. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this second session. These sessions are designed to help boost creativity and innovation, to help learn monitor leadership strategies, discuss concepts with our faculty and global experts, and connect with industry peers. We're going to be meeting every Monday, with the exception of Martin Luther King Day, where we'll meet on a Tuesday at noon. Our faculty and thought leaders are all volunteers doing their part to help create better leaders. And we believe by doing so that we're going to help create honest leaders with integrity and compassion. Every week is someone new, and look forward to this series evolving, growing, and offering content that is applicable to your business. So today we have the honor of having Neil Stroll, who will address leadership development from the inside out. And you're going to learn about the idea of mindset and how the foundation of leadership resembles a philosophy of life. Neil Stroll is co-facilitator of Chloe's Leadership Coaching Certification Program. He's trained originally as a psychologist and blends more than 25 years of experience in organizational consulting and the perspective of applied psychology to help executives build their leadership capabilities. The only professional activity that Neil enjoys more than coaching leaders is training professional coaches. He is founding faculty member of Georgetown University's Certificate in Leadership Coaching Program and has been on the teaching coaching faculty to a diverse body for over 20 years. He has served on the faculty of Georgetown McDonough School of Business and also the American University programs. So I'd like to introduce Neil Stroll and just let everyone know before he begins that we will entertain some questions at the end for anyone who'd like to stay. Just add them to the chat. Okay, without further ado, let's welcome Neil.
Hey, good morning, or good afternoon now, I suppose. I'm so pleased the opportunity to be able to talk to you this afternoon. In preparation for my presentation, I did listen to Jim Lemoyne talk about leadership, and he also uses a quote that I love to do when talking about leadership, is the idea of pornography. You know it when you see it. But I would also like to add the idea that part of the confusion I think about understanding is leadership is that we insist on wanting to see it as a unitary concept. And I would say one way out of that box is not think of it that way. And in fact, I would suggest to you that to really get a handle on leadership, it serves us all well to think of it as three kinds of ways of operating. One has to do is how you conduct yourself when you're the person in charge. So what kind of leader are you in those conditions? Secondly, we can talk about leadership as a set of skills or competencies. We're not going to define them this afternoon, but that's, and the third one is the idea that leadership is a philosophy. It's a philosophy of life, and it's a philosophy, again, of how you conduct yourself when you're in charge. Hold on, let me get my cursor over here. But today, what I want to talk about is the difference between leadership versus leadership development. So what Jim was talking about was this idea of getting a handle on what we're really talking about when we talk about leadership. I want to approach the question a little bit differently, which is, if you aspire to be more leader-like in how you conduct yourself, then the question you're really wrestling with is leadership development. How do I develop myself to be more of a leader? And here's the metaphor I'd like to start with. It's based on Dante's Inferno. Some people know it better as the Divine Comedy. But this is the opening verse in the whole poem, the whole epic poem. But when you translate from Romantic Italian into English, it doesn't sound quite grammatical, but so you might have seen it before. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a dark wood, so dark that the straight way was utterly lost. And what Dante was referring to was the idea that, so here I am, I'm a middle-aged man, I've lived most of my life, and at this point, I don't know what the hell I'm doing, right? I'm kind of lost, which I think happens to a lot of us on our journey to adulthood. We come to our version of the fork in the road, and we're still wrestling with questions of identity. We're still wrestling with questions of aspirations. Who do I want to be? And so what I want to talk about is this question of development. I want to talk about this question of, to what degree do you aspire to to actually be a leader and conduct yourself in a more leader-like way? That's the question. You get to decide about how you want to answer it, all right? But in preparation for thinking about the answer, I'd like to give you some things to think about, right? And so one of the things I'd like to say is that this idea of development, it's what I like to call dancing with the future. You're creating your relationship with a version of yourself that's purely aspirational. Who do you want to be in the future? But in terms of how we have relationship with the future, development is only one of the dynamics that's at work. So the first one is this thing I'm going to call aging and maturing, right? There's not one of us in this room today who's not an adult. And if you compare yourself to the version of who you were, let us say, 20 years ago, right? You're just going to immediately recognize that there's things that you know, that there's ways you think, there's things you understand that are different from that version of you that you were 20 years earlier. And I would submit to you, if we could somehow project into the future, I promise you that when you get 20 years into the future, you will see that there are ways that you're thinking, there are ways you think about yourself and things about your life that are not available to you yet. That still is going to come as an outcome of simply maturing. So that's one of the ways we have a relationship with the future. Now, there's a second one that we're going to call evolving and adapting, which simply says that just by virtue of being alive, we are interacting with the world around us. And sometimes the environment has an impact on us, and sometimes we have an impact on the environment. That's what evolving and adapting are all about. And the one thing I would want to say about these two is that they are inevitable. They are going to happen whether or not you like it or you want it. You are going to age and you are going to evolve and adapt. There's no choice involved. The real relationship with the future that is about choice is the one that I'm going to call development. And I want to talk about leadership development. What I want to talk about is this idea of leadership development from the inside out. Now, I don't know how many of you who are in the session today have military experience. But from my perspective, there's no better vehicle for learning how to lead than having served in the military. Now, some of you may not fully agree with that premise, but I'm telling you that's what I believe. But what's interesting about the military is they have a leadership development model that we can't replicate, right? Most of the military approach to leadership is based on two variables that are no longer available. One is, generally speaking, they get you when you're young. Most of the people, when they join the military, are going to be between 18 and 24. And again, I would ask you to remember who you were when you were that age. And if you can't see it yet, I would just point out to you that you're so much more impressionable then than you are now. Now, I would say that we're all still pretty impressionable, but when you're 18 to 24, you're that much more impressionable. And the second thing that the military does is they take full control of the environment. They determine, when you wake up, when you go to sleep, what your days are going to be like, what your meals are going to be like. Everything is controlled environment, and there's an underlying premise and an underlying design to it, right? That's leadership development from the outside in, right? But we're going to talk about is leadership development from the inside out. So I just want to start again with the idea of what we're talking about with the idea of development, all right? So here's this thing that I'm going to call creating the future. So here is you, right? And one of the things about all of us can recognize with this, I'm putting this yellow dot, is called that the moment of your birth, right? And then I can put this, a purple star and call that now. And I think what most of us can readily recognize that between the moment of birth and the moment we're in right now today is this thing that's been forming over the last however many years you've been on Earth that we're going to call identity. It's your sense of self. It's coherent. If you and I were seatmates on an airplane for a long, transatlantic flight, and we decided we want to talk to each other, and we got to know each other, you might tell me a story of who you are in your life. And it would have a lot of similarities with every other time you've ever told that story to another human being. There's a coherence that we think of to our own identity, our own sense of self. Now, an artifact of that sense of self is this thing that I'm going to call momentum. Your life resembles a train on a set of tracks. And once the train pulls out of the station, it's going. And basically, it's not stopping. And this is all of us on our life. That because of momentum, every one of us is at risk from a developmental perspective to be moving towards a future that resembles the past. That's true for all of us. Now, that's not to say there's no judgment about whether that's good or bad. The only question is, are you heading somewhere where you actually want to go, right? Because the risk for a lot of us is we could do a version of sleepwalking in our own life. Now, I don't know yet to what degree you've ever lived in the question of how much you want to live your life in a leader-like way. That's a question that we'll talk about a little bit, as this afternoon session goes on. But that's the question we're trying to answer: is to what degree do you want the future to resemble the past? If you say, I'm actually starting to think for a lot of different reasons that I want to get off this set of tracks and I want to be moving towards a different kind of future, then what I'm going to ask you is, to what degree are you able to create an image of the future that, however it's different from the past, can you articulate it? Can you put language onto it? If you want to incorporate the language of goals, that's fine. But what can we make that like more real, more palpable? The idea of an image of the future that's not like your past. And then what development becomes is how we're going to get there, right? The relationship between, this new way of moving, so that at some point in the future, I'm going to be a version of me that's one that I've chosen. All right. So that's what we're here to talk about. Now I'm going to take this idea, and what I'd like to do is now talk about it from the point of view of how to be a leader. Right. So let me start with this idea that we're going to call mindsets. Now, I don't know how many of you are actually in a leadership role at this time. But to make it simple, let's just talk about the idea that you're the person in charge. Now, in reality, we have lots of different words to talk about the people in charge. We have leader, we have executive, we have supervisor, we have manager. All of those get a little bit conflated and kind of overlap boundaries, and I'd like to pull them apart a little bit. But every time that you're in a potentially leadership role, you're bringing a certain mindset to it. So the first one I'm going to call administrative, right? Now, I live in DC. The one thing about DC that is the business of government is our predominant business here in Washington. And when you look at most of the federal agencies, their function more than anything else is regulatory. That's the major function of most of the executive level agencies. And when you're in the regulatory business, then your mindset more often than not will be administrative. And administrative by its definition is backward looking. What we're saying is that at some point in the past, we developed a bunch of rules and processes and regulation that determine what our business is. And as an administrator, my job is to make sure that those rules are being complied with. So my focus is mostly one of maintenance. I'm really, for the most part, not trying to change anything. The only time I'm going to be interested in the business of change is when somebody comes up with a new regulation for me to enforce. But otherwise, as an administrator, your business is about kind of making sure the rules are being followed. Now, the question is, for some of those of you who are in the roles of department chair or deans or associate deans, a lot of those roles have a massive administrative component. And the question is that what's really the framework for your mindset to the job? That I feel like I'm doing a good job, that I'm an effective leader to the extent administratively we're doing things well here. So we'll call that the administrative mindset. Now, there's a second mindset, and this one dominates a lot in for-profit businesses, and that's management, right? And if you're a good manager, mostly what you're focusing is on getting things done, right? If you think of management as a metaphor, as being like an automobile factory, it's a production line. At one end, you have raw materials, and at the other end, you have finished products. And the best managers run the production line really, really effectively and efficiently so that those raw materials are not only converted into finished products, but they are done with the minimum amount of errors, the minimum amount of waste. We're using our resources well. So the focus is on operations and the focus is on incremental improvement, right? That's the management mindset. And the third mindset is the one that we're going to call leadership, right? And the thing that is distinctive about leading versus managing and administering is its focus is on the future. Wherever we are, ultimately, we're always thinking about what's next. What's that next thing that we want to do, that next place we want to go to. So we're continually focusing on possibilities. And if you're really thinking like and operating like a leader, you're continually challenging the status quo, right? These are three mindsets. And it's not all or none. The question is, depending upon the role that you're trying to fulfill, what's the proper percentage of mindset that you want to apportion to the role you're in? And when people, if you're really in an administrative role, there's nothing bad that you're doing about approaching it with an administrative mindset. But what's really interesting is the era in which we live. Perhaps you're familiar with the acronym called VUCA, which stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And in a VUCA environment, as a general rule, leaders are more suited to VUCA than managers and administrators. And so that's what I would be asking you to think about. Given the context in which you're operating, do you need to do that in a more leader-like way? All right. So the question we want to ask is, if I really want to be more leader-like, then how do I get there? Now, I will tell you that I'm not a neutral of opinion about this. Since it's too late for us to go and be in the military, I personally truly believe that the best way to become more of a leader, if that's what you aspire, is to work with a leadership coach. I think personally that this stuff works better one-on-one, tailored to you, than it does in a leadership development class. Although I will tell you that a really well-designed leadership development program with the focus on development as much as training will take you very close to where you want to go. But let's just look at the development process. And so here's how I'd like to talk about it with you, is the idea that there are three massive questions that we all have to answer. And they are: what matters, what's missing, and what's next, right? And in each of these three questions, there's what I'm going to call an inner game and an outer game. And so your development begins with the inner game on the inside. We're going to go from the inside out. So the inner game of what matters, as a general rule, can be distilled down to two massive questions that you need to get clarity on for yourself. One is, what are your most cherished values? Because one of the defining properties about leadership is, what do you actually stand for? Who are you, right? So you need to get some clarity about your values. And the second thing that needs clarity under the heading of what matters is the question of vitality. Where does your energy really come from? When you feel like you're the best version of you and you're the most alive and you're serving your bigger purpose, what do you know about that? So the first part of development is this inner game of what matters. Now, as you get clarity about that, you can look at the outer game of what matters, which really is, to what degree do I conduct myself operationally? How do I behave? Is what I say, is what I do a reflection of what I say? That's the outer game of what matters. And so it comes a game in the beginning, your development, of closing gaps. I espouse this. What do I actually do? And if I discover a gap, what can I do to reduce it? And so the first cycle of development for most of us is just what I said, gap reducing. Then there'll come a point where you'll realize that you've closed as many of the gaps as you possibly can, and you've kind of hit your version of the wall. So then when I hit my version of the wall, I go to the next question is, so what's missing? What is it that's preventing me from becoming more of my aspirational self? Now, it can be skills, it can be resources, it can be relationships, like, in an organizational environment, you don't have the right skill mix on your team and things like that. But you need to be the one to figure out what is missing that's preventing me from being the leader I want to be. And then the outer game of what's missing is figuring out how to address that, right? And so in the beginning of our development as a leader, the process, the cycle kind of looks like a NASCAR racetrack, a sideways 8. I go from the inner game of what's missing to the outer game of what's missing. The inner game of what matters to the outer game of what matters to the inner game of what's missing to the outer. And I just keep doing that loop. And then I'll find out that basically I've done pretty good, hopefully. I'm kind of more the person I said I was, but in the process, the world has changed. So I've got to kind of keep up with it. And so then the next question becomes, what's next? And to the answer the question of what's next, I'm going to have to go back to what matters and find out what's kind of important to me, right? So that's the model that I'm talking about with development, right? So I want to come back then, because I said, well, really what matters, the two questions you most have to answer have to do with what are my values and where does my vitality come from? And so I just want to take a moment to talk about values, because I don't know how much you've actually thought about this. So values are really different from beliefs, right? We can believe all sorts of things, but beliefs can be expressed in words. You don't have to act out your beliefs. When you actually say that they're sacred, I'm going to convert them into action, then it becomes a value. So my favorite analogy of this is people who believe in environmental responsibility and greenness. But if you talk like that, but you don't recycle, you don't do all sorts kind of things that demonstrate your environmental responsibility, then it's a belief and not a value. And when you're a leader, your values are on public display all the time. That's one of the way prospective followers judge you, whether or not they want to follow you. Because your words and deeds are on display, your integrity is always on display. And if there's not a correspondence between words and deeds, then people say, I don't know if I really want to follow this person, right? So this next slide is just designed, if you don't have this kind of exposure, just here's how it works. And if you've never heard of Sid Simon, he's not from the current era, he's like from more than 40 years ago, but he was the person who kind of engineered this domain called values clarification. So for it really to be a value, you need to have chosen it yourself. It needs to have been chosen among alternatives. And you thought about it, you realize if I stand up for this value, I might have to sacrifice something in the process, right? There's something at risk here. And there has to be some real energy about it, so that when you actually feel that you've stood up for your values, it energizes you, right? If you only tell yourself the value, but you never publicly affirm it, it's probably not one of your most cherished values, right? And as we talked about, it has to be acted upon. And finally, it's part of a definite period of action. And don't forget, all these slides are going to be available for you, after our webinar. So I know I'm kind of getting ready to run out of time here. So let me come up with just a few key ideas about development, and then I'll try and wrap it up. So what we're talking about as a leader, you'll be most effective as a leader if you can access this idea that I'm going to call your best self. So to get to your best self, you want to actually take ownership, this idea of I'm going to see the future I want and pursue it. So I'm going to solve for power and choice. In order to do that, I have to be thoughtful. I have to be reflective. This idea of shoot first and ask questions later is not a leader-like behavior at all. It won't get you, this action-oriented stereotype of we have leadership. It's really, it was never true in the first place, but it's certainly not apropos of the era in which we currently live. And the only way you're going to get there is if you're willing to experiment, try things out that you haven't done before. Notice what makes you uncomfortable and work with it, right? These are some of the ways you get towards becoming your better self. And then I'll just kind of conclude by just kind of taking the same slide and describing it in more of a list way, right? So to be on the developmental path, you really need to learn how to notice yourself, notice the reactions of other people. You have to become more aware, right? And so to do that, it's a willingness to be reflective. At some point, you're going to have to decide that there's a future that you want to pursue for yourself and prospective followers that's different from how it's been in the past or present. And then how do I get myself to pursue that and bring that future into the present? And therefore, you're going to have to become intentional. And then it's about practice, practice, practice. So that is kind of the whole presentation for me. I'm willing to stick around for those of you who might want to talk about any of these ideas or have any questions, but I will turn it over back to Molly.
Thank you, Dr. Stroll. As you know, we have participants joining us from around the world, specifically Ghana, Costa Rica, and India. And so Dr. Dorothy Shaw Samoa on our faculty has asked the question of you, are leadership mindsets impacted by cultural backgrounds, culture in terms of individualistic versus collectivist society?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that what culture reveals to you, among other things, is in that particular culture, what is cherished or valued. So I think you'll always need to be appropriate to a particular culture. And it's not just national cultures, it's organizational cultures. When Lou Gerstner left Nabisco to take over IBM, the whole thing blew up for him because he was so culturally inappropriate. What he learned about how to lead at Nabisco was not a good fit for how to lead IBM. And he had to figure out, oh, it's not about I'm going to change IBM. I need to change in order to effectively and successfully lead IBM. So yeah, you have to be culturally appropriate in my view.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stroll. And for anyone who could join us next week, look in your email inbox every Friday. We'll be giving you a lineup of who our speakers are. Next up is Dr. Dorothy Shaw Samoa, who's going to be talking about leading with grit. So thank you for joining us. We'll stay on for anyone else who'd like to ask some questions of Neil, and we'll stop the recording now. Thank you.
Thanks.